Continuation of the contract. So we are now on page 3. This is the survey portion. This states how a survey will be provided if one is required, and also who will pay for it if it is either not provided or not approved. We typically will do option 1, assuming that a seller does have a survey. Big thing is that they need to provide it within X number of days. The survey and the T47 affidavit. This used to have to be notarized. It no longer does need to be notarized, but it does need to be filled out by the seller, and both need to be provided. And that needs to be provided to the buyer, but also to the lender. The title company or the lender could potentially deny it. So this second part of the question is, if the survey is not approved, who pays for the new one? If there is financing, a survey is required in Texas. That is not the case for all states, but it is for Texas. If a survey is not available, so if the owner does not have one, then it would be selecting 2 or 3, which is that the buyer would be paying for one within X number of days, or the seller would be paying for a new one within X number of days. If my buyer is agreeing to pay for that survey, then I would likely put something like 21 days or 25 days if it's a typical 30-day contract, just so that way they're not incurring the expense of a survey if they potentially don't buy the house. So we want to ideally make sure it's happening maybe after the appraisal, but with enough time to close. The cost of the survey does vary, but probably about $550 for most typical properties. If it is on acreage and is not in one of those standard lot and blocks, but more meets and bounds, then the cost does go up. It could be a couple $1,000s depending on how long the property or how large the property is. Typically, the initial survey is approved. A good example of when one would not be approved is if it's a very, very old survey, missing seals. They have like an official seal on the survey itself. Or if you have a shortage of area policy and there's been a modification and something is written into the T47, then it's more likely to get denied if you have that shortage of area policy. It's kind of 50-50 on whether or not it's a buyer or seller expense. I normally will start off with it being a seller expense, and we may get a counter offer from the seller on that fact. Next section is the objections. So this is writing in if there was any specific objections, specific things your client wants to do with the property. Say they want to have a chicken coop or put in a pool or have a daycare, something specific that they have told you they want to do with the property, and they want to make sure that they can. They will receive the title commitment, exceptions, a survey, all of those things from the title company, and this is giving them an out in the contract if they receive those documents and do not accept the specifics as far as whether or not they can have that pool or that chicken coop. That would give them an out in the contract based on how many days you've put in there. So it says after the days received of receiving those documents. So sometimes that clock does start a little bit later if you haven't received the exceptions or you haven't received the survey right off the bat. This is more title information and also disclosing about the homeowners association. So this would be disclosing if there is or is not. If it is in an HOA, there is a specific form related to a homeowners association that would then be brought into this agreement. You can easily tell if it is in an HOA or not by looking on the listing and it says HOA, yes or no. There's some additional statements in here regarding that needing to be added into the contract, the HOA document. And there are also some other things that aren't necessarily things we go over a ton, like tidewaters aren't really applicable for our area. Annexation, once again, that's not really applicable most of the time, but that would be basically a CYA as far as if a city was like taking over annexing an area. This whole section is a lot of legalese mainly. Most buyers don't ask about it, but a lot of it's just general disclosures. This right here is disclosing if the property is part of a public improvement district or utility district, so a PID or a MUD. You can look that up online. You can also tell by looking at the tax report, just like we looked at before, to find if it was in city limits and what city. You could also see if it's part of a improvement district, the listing agent should know, and they have a form specifically to provide for that. This is whether or not you have received a seller's disclosure notice. 99.9% of the time, the check mark will be yes, I have this defaulted as that we have received it. If it has not been received, which would be a bad thing on the seller and the listing agent's part, if you read that, it says they have a certain number of days to send it to you, and then you get an extra 7 days from when they send it to you, which is why we pretty much never have it be option 2 there. It's always pretty much option 1. The only time that the seller's disclosure does not need to be provided is if it is a foreclosure, a new construction, or an estate. And frankly, even when it's an estate, if the heirs have a lot of knowledge about the property, I will still do a seller's disclosure just because it does help with giving information you do know, and generally just helps the process go smoother. Otherwise, people are just assuming you absolutely know nothing about the property, and they have to take a lot of extra steps to try to do their own due diligence. Another disclosure about lead-based paint. If it's built before 1978, then you'd basically be triggered to include that form. And then this is about as-is clause. This is a big one that I always go over with my buyers and my sellers because this can get you into trouble as far as expectations. I have it defaulted to the top option. The only time you're using the second option is if there's a specific thing like the seller has already advertised the roof is getting replaced, or the seller has already told you they're doing some type of repair. You would write it in. But it does specifically say you can't use general phrases like subject to inspection. Your leverage, so your buyer goes under contract as is, always, but your leverage to negotiate repairs is the termination option inspection period. So your leverage is we ask for repairs, you say no, we enact the termination option clause and terminate, get our earnest money back, and the seller gets just the option fee portion and go back on the market. So every contract is as is in Texas. I don't like to use the phrase as is when I'm advertising a listing because then you're basically telling people you're not negotiable and you're going to be a pain in the butt and the property probably has issues. These next couple paragraphs aren't super pertinent as far as the day-to-day. This is talking about lender required repairs. We don't see it very often, and if we do, it's typically very minor things like wood rot if it was a VA loan. Something like that. Normally you're going to know that you're going to have extensive repairs, but 99% of the time you're not going to deal with that. And then you have a paragraph about completion of the repairs themselves. So the seller shall complete all repairs and treatments prior to closing and require permits. The repairs must be performed by a person who is licensed or provides that type of service. So this is a big thing when I'm talking to my seller, making sure that they understand the repairs need to be done by someone legit and they need to be prepared to give receipts, give invoices. If your seller is handy, but he's not a licensed electrician, he can't do the electrical work if it's in the contract that you're going to fix something, which is why on the selling side, you prefer a credit in lieu of a repair because it doesn't give you as much liability. You also see there's note there about sellers responsible for, transferring warranties in respect to repairs are at the buyer treatment to buyer at closing. If seller fails to complete all agreed repairs and treatments prior to closing, the buyer may exercise remedy in paragraph 15, which is basically the right to terminate, and basically obligates the seller to make repairs. On to the like the residential service contract, we call those home warranties. Essentially, somebody got their lobby to add this into our contracts, but this would be a credit that the seller would pay towards the buyer picking a home warranty of their choice. A lot of times I'll put like $600 in here. I'd say it's about 50-50 whether or not we even bother. It used to be a very common thing. During COVID, we pretty much stopped using home warranties altogether. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of home warranties. Mainly, I've had kind of hit or miss on them covering things. There's a misunderstanding that they cover like pre-existings. So if the roof is, or if the HVAC is shot when your client buys the house, but they get a home warranty, they're still not going to probably cover the cost of the HVAC getting replaced. So it's not really a catch-all that At one point it was pretty good and was helpful, but not so much anymore. But basically it's a credit that the seller would pay, and then the buyer gets to choose who they want, and it's on the closing disclosure, the payment. If, say, you put $600 here and the buyer picks a $700 plan, then the closing disclosure would have the $600 from the seller and then a $100 from the buyer, and the title company actually is the one cutting the check to the home warranty company to start that home warranty on the day of closing. Next paragraph is if the agent is one of the buyer or seller, or ownership in some way, or as the buyer or as the seller if the agents are. Also, this is where you would disclose if you're a spouse, parent, child, business entity, any of that. So if your sister buys a house, you would need to disclose that you are related to the buyer. And then this is where you'd put the closing date. It technically says on or before. We normally don't see it on the on or the before. We see it normally on the day, mainly because the title company and the lender are all working towards that date since that's on the contract. If that date is not able to be met, it is not the end of the world, and it's not normally even a monetary cost for the delay. Say it gets pushed 2 days for lending or something, you just do a amendment and adjust that date. Next is about the possession. So this is where you say whether or not it's upon closing and funding or according to a temporary lease agreement, which we'll talk about. If it is an occupied home, sometimes a seller will ask to get a couple extra days in the house. They are protected by basically that lease agreement if that happens. Otherwise, upon closing and funding means it's not when you sign, it's when the title company has given their blessing. That's what funding means, that the title company has received funding authorization from the lender that gave the loan to the buyer. The buyer's money, buyer and seller have all signed the contract, and the title company has basically blessed the transaction. One of the big things that sometimes the seller will have the misunderstanding, it does not mean the seller has to have received their funds. Sometimes we will fund late in the day after the federal wire transfer cutoff, and the buyer's money is there, the buyer's lender's money is there, and the title company funds it. It doesn't mean that the seller's money's hit their account necessarily. I've had that happen where we fund Friday afternoon, seller's money doesn't hit their account till lunchtime Monday. That doesn't really matter. The buyers still get access to the property starting that late Friday afternoon when the title company authorizes it. We'll talk about the temporary lease in a minute. Smart devices, this is an extra disclosure saying that that stuff is supposed to stay and is supposed to be transferred to the new homeowner. If there are cameras, Ring doorbell, security system, all that stuff is supposed to stay unless it's listed on the exclusions. And then with special provisions, we leave that blank. But say there wasn't a lot and block, or there wasn't a real address, there was just a legal description for like a piece of land. We wouldn't use this contract for a piece of land. First off, we'd use the land contract. But if we needed to specify like a legal lot and block, or say there was some type of oddity as far as that, you could write that in as far as a factual statement, clarifying where you're talking about, what you're identifying, but you're not really supposed to put anything in that because we are not lawyers and we are not acting as lawyers. To paragraph 12. So this is one that has been amended in recent months. So this is specifying any closing cost credits. This traditionally was just a single line here for a credit that a seller was giving to a buyer, and now it also is including commissions as well. So essentially the first two lines are specifically regarding brokerage fee items. So if they were not wanting to use a 2402, you would instead list your commission here. Or that's an or, not an and, or you would leave that blank and you would list it on the 2402 what the buyer agent compensation would be. But that is totally not related to this part specifically, which is a closing cost credit for the buyer. And that would be normally where we're putting in, if there's a closing cost credit in lieu of a repair, that's the part where we would be amending in the contract. So when we go for amendments, that's where that would be. There's another section here about prorations. So when we pay homeowners insurance, we pay homeowners insurance in advance. So if you pay your bill in January, you are paying for that year. If you, but for property taxes, you pay property taxes in arrears, meaning you pay for the year you just spent, not the year to come. So when we pay property taxes in December, we paid them for the year we just spent in the house, not for the next year. So basically how it works, the title company will, to the best of their abilities, estimate the total property tax bill, and then they will charge the seller from January 1st through the day of closing, giving a credit on the closing disclosure to the buyer. That way, when the bill comes due in December at the end of the year, the buyer is responsible for that full year's taxes because they've already been given a credit from the seller. Big issue with that is that can be come up quite a bit is that we only get the final bills in like October. So the title company is forced to estimate it based on the prior year. So for example, right now we're in 2025. So they are using 2024's number, even though it could be significantly different than 2025. There is a full right for the buyer to go back to the seller and ask for a reproration of taxes. That is not done through the title company, that's done through us. So if it's a investment property where it's not protected by things like a homestead exemption or a senior exemption, there's not really something capping it and keeping it from going up too much. That's where we would get involved if that happened. It doesn't happen all the time, but it has happened where I've had to step in and help with that after closing. And then these are basically talking about what happens if things go wrong, as far as what happens if somebody defaults, attorney's fees, casualty loss, like the property's burned down or something. And then also how monies are held as far as escrow, representation, disclosures. So I call this the legalese page because there's nothing to fill out on page 7.